There's a specific kind of silence that happens at night when your phone is in your hand and you're thinking about someone you haven't been able to fully let go of. Not because they're perfect, not because things are easy with them, but because, deep down, something about them felt familiar. Like you didn't have to perform as much. Like for once, you weren't completely misunderstood. And I want you to be honest with yourself right now, because this is just between you and me. When you think of that person, there's still a part of you that believes we could actually be something real. Not in a fantasy way, not in a desperate way, but in that quiet, persistent way that doesn't really leave you alone. If you're watching this, you might already be feeling a little exposed, like I'm speaking too directly to something you've kept private. And before you scroll away or dismiss it, just stay with me for a few minutes. If this resonates even slightly, you might want to like this video or subscribe. Not because I'm asking you to, but because this conversation might not be finished with you yet. Now, let's slow this down. When people say you're made for each other, it sounds romantic, clean, comforting. But what I've seen, sitting across from men like you for years, is that this idea is often where things get complicated. Because potential is not the same as readiness, and connection is not the same as capacity. You might feel something intense with her. You might even notice that when she looks at you, something in you softens, or tightens, or wakes up in a way you can't quite explain. But here's the part most men don't want to sit with. If it truly feels like you're made for each other, then why hasn't it become stable yet? Why does it feel like timing keeps slipping? Why does closeness come, and then distance follows? I'm not saying this to discourage you. I'm saying it because your mind is already trying to solve it emotionally instead of observing it honestly. And there's a difference. Because sometimes what we call the right person is actually the person who activates something unresolved inside us. Something unfinished. Something that feels like home, but isn't fully safe yet. And before you decide what this connection is, I want to walk with you through what it might be asking from you first. Because if you rush this part, you don't get clarity, you get repetition. And I don't think that's what you actually want anymore. So stay with me. There's something men rarely get told directly, so they end up learning it the hard way. Attraction doesn't just pull you towards someone, it also pulls you toward your own unfinished patterns. And I know that sounds abstract, but in real life it shows up very clearly. It shows up when you find yourself overthinking simple messages. It shows up when you replay conversations, trying to decode what she really meant. It shows up when your calm disappears the moment she becomes slightly distant. And then, without realizing it, you start to believe that intensity is proof of importance. But intensity is not clarity, it's activation. Now I want you to think about her specifically. Not the ideal version you present to others, not the version you justify in your head, but the real dynamic between you two. Does it feel steady, or does it feel alive in bursts? Do you feel seen, or do you feel occasionally chosen? Because there's a subtle but powerful difference between those two experiences. One builds you, the other keeps you emotionally alert. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Sometimes when a man says, "We're made for each other," what he's actually describing is emotional familiarity mixed with uncertainty. That combination is powerful. It creates longing. It creates obsession disguised as love. It makes waiting feel meaningful. But I want to ask you something gently, and I don't want you to answer too quickly in your head. If you removed the emotional charge, the anticipation, the hope of what she could become with you, what exactly would remain between you two right now? Not in theory, in reality. Because I've seen this pattern enough times to recognize it. A man doesn't always miss the person. He misses the version of himself that appears when he's trying to earn her closeness. More focused, more intentional, more emotionally awake. And that version feels valuable. So he assumes the connection must be valuable too. But what if the relationship is not the source of that feeling? What if it's just the stage where it gets triggered? That's not a conclusion, it's just something to sit with. Because if you're honest, part of you might already know the truth, but another part keeps negotiating with it. And that negotiation, that internal back and forth, is often where men stay stuck the longest. Not in love, not in loss, but in interpretation. And until that clears, everything else stays emotionally blurry. I want to tell you something that might sound a little uncomfortable at first, but I need you to stay with it, not reject it just because it challenges the story you've been holding. A lot of emotional confusion doesn't come from not knowing what's happening. It comes from knowing, but not wanting to accept the full weight of it. And in relationships like the one you're thinking about, there's often a quiet internal split. One part of you is responding to what is actually being shown to you. The other part is responding to what you felt in the best moments. Those two versions don't always match. And when they don't, men often default to the version that feels more meaningful, not the one that's more consistent. Because meaning is powerful. It gives suffering a direction. It makes waiting feel like loyalty. It turns uncertainty into something worth enduring. But let me slow that down for you. Ask yourself, not as a test, but as a moment of honesty, when she is not emotionally available, do you feel peaceful? Or do you feel pulled into analysis, interpretation, and internal negotiation? Because peace is often underestimated in attraction. We think excitement means connection, but stability, calm, emotional predictability, those are not signs of boredom, they're signs of nervous system safety. And here's where things get even more subtle. Sometimes a man doesn't realize he's attached not to the person, but to the emotional chase pattern that forms around her. The waiting, the uncertainty, the small moments of warmth that feel disproportionately powerful because they interrupt distance. It creates a loop. Distance, hope, brief closeness, emotional spike, distance again. And over time, the brain starts to associate that cycle with depth. But depth isn't the same as fluctuation. I know that might feel like I'm stripping something meaningful away from you, but I'm not. I'm trying to separate what is real connection from what is emotional conditioning. Because if you don't separate those two, you can end up building entire internal narratives around someone who is only partially available to you, not because they are wrong, but because the dynamic itself is incomplete. And incomplete dynamics always feel like they're almost meant to be. That almost is what keeps it alive in your mind longer than it stays alive in reality. And I want to be very careful here because I'm not telling you to detach or to decide anything right now. I'm asking you to see more clearly than your feelings are currently allowing. Because clarity doesn't kill connection, it just removes illusion from it. And what remains after that is where your real answer begins to form. There's a moment in almost every emotionally intense connection where something quietly shifts, and most people miss it. It's not a breakup, it's not a fight, it's not even distance at first. It's something much quieter. It's the moment you start monitoring yourself. You start asking, did I say too much? You start adjusting your tone. You start timing your messages a little more carefully than feels natural. And without realizing it, you begin to shrink your emotional expression just enough to keep the connection from slipping away. Now listen to me carefully here. This is not about blame. It's about pattern recognition. Because when a man is truly grounded in a connection, he doesn't feel like he has to manage his presence inside it. He simply is. But when something feels uncertain, the mind starts working overtime to stabilize what the dynamic itself cannot stabilize. And that's where things become psychologically expensive, because you don't just lose emotional clarity, you start losing yourself in micro-adjustments. And she might not even be doing anything intentionally to cause this. That's the part that makes it confusing. She may be warm at times, distant at others, present when it suits her capacity, quiet when life takes her elsewhere. But your nervous system doesn't experience that as neutral information. It experiences it as something to solve. And so you begin building internal theories. She's just busy. She needs time. If I communicate better, it will shift. If I stay steady enough, she'll meet me there. And maybe some of those things are partially true. But here's the question I want you to sit with. At what point does patience become self-abandonment dressed as understanding? Because there is a line, a very subtle one, where being emotionally mature turns into over-functioning in a dynamic that isn't reciprocal. And men rarely notice that line while they're inside it. They only notice it later, when they realize they've been holding emotional consistency for two people. I want you to imagine something for a moment, not as a prediction, just as a perspective shift. If you stopped trying to interpret her behavior, if you stopped filling in the gaps, if you stopped emotionally negotiating with uncertainty, what would her presence actually feel like in your life? Would it feel steady enough to relax into? Or would it feel like something you're always slightly preparing for? Because your body already knows the answer before your mind agrees to it. And what I'm really trying to show you here is this. If you constantly have to adjust yourself to maintain connection, then what you're calling compatibility might actually be adaptation under emotional pressure. And that is not the same thing. Not even close. There's a strange thing that happens when you're emotionally invested in someone who isn't fully steady with you. You don't just think about them more. You start interpreting everything through them. A song doesn't feel like a song anymore. It feels like a reminder. A quiet evening doesn't feel neutral. It feels like absence. Even your own progress starts to feel slightly delayed, as if part of you is waiting for something unresolved to catch up. And I want to be careful here, because this isn't about demonizing her or turning her into a problem. It's about noticing what happens inside you when the connection is not fully reciprocal. Because the mind doesn't like uncertainty, it fills it. And what it fills it with is usually hope. But hope, when it's not anchored in consistent behavior, becomes something very different. It becomes emotional glue. It keeps you attached not to what is happening, but to what might still happen. And that might can become powerful enough to override what you are actually experiencing. I've seen men sit in this space for months, sometimes years, not because they are weak, but because the emotional highs were meaningful enough to justify the emotional lows. That's the trap no one talks about. Not that it's all bad, but that it's sometimes good enough to keep you stuck. And I want you to consider something that might feel slightly confronting. When you think about her, do you feel more grounded in your life or more internally preoccupied? Because real connection tends to simplify your emotional world. It doesn't constantly complicate it. You don't find yourself decoding silence. You don't find yourself measuring effort. You don't find yourself replaying moments to find hidden meanings. You simply know where you stand. And if you don't, your mind steps in to create a version of standing that feels tolerable. But tolerable is not the same as healthy. Now here's the deeper layer. Sometimes a man stays not because the connection is stable, but because leaving would force him to confront the emotional investment he already made. The time, the energy, the internal hope he built around her. And letting that go can feel like admitting it meant nothing. But that's not the truth. It did mean something. It just may not mean what you hoped it meant. And there's a difference between honoring an experience and continuing it beyond its reality. Because if you keep extending something that is emotionally inconsistent, you don't eventually get clarity. You just get fatigue. And fatigue can feel like love fading when it's actually your system asking for relief. We're getting close to the part where everything becomes very clear, but only if you're willing to see it without the emotional filters. There's a point in these kinds of connections where something quietly changes in you, and you don't even notice it happening in real time. You stop expecting consistency, you start expecting moments, and without realizing it, your emotional baseline shifts, not toward stability, but toward anticipation. You begin to measure the connection not by how it feels overall, but by how it feels when it's good again. And that's a very specific psychological shift. Because now, your reference point is no longer, how do I feel in this relationship most of the time? It becomes, when will it feel good again? Do you see the difference? One is grounded in reality, the other is oriented toward return. And return-based attachment is powerful, but unstable, because it always places your emotional center outside of your present experience. Now, I want to slow this down, because this is where a lot of men quietly stay stuck for a long time. You don't stop caring, you just start organizing your emotional world around unpredictability. You become more patient, but also more internally restless. More understanding, but also more emotionally occupied. And from the outside, it can even look like maturity. But internally, it feels like waiting. And waiting has a cost. Not just time, but presence. Because while part of you is emotionally invested in her, another part of you starts becoming unavailable to your actual life. Your focus gets fragmented. Your energy gets partially locked in replaying interactions that already happened, and the present starts feeling slightly muted. Now here's something I want you to consider gently. If someone is truly aligned with your emotional life, you don't feel like you're constantly re-entering the connection. You stay in it. There isn't this repeated cycle of leaving and returning internally. But when there is that cycle, the mind often tries to romanticize it as depth, as if intensity proves significance. But sometimes intensity is just instability with emotional meaning attached to it. And I know that can feel like I'm reducing something important, but I'm actually trying to give you your power back from interpretation. Because as long as you keep interpreting inconsistency as sign, you stay emotionally reactive to it. And that keeps you in a loop where clarity never fully arrives. Only anticipation does. And anticipation is not a place you can live in forever without it costing you something internally. So I want you to hold a very simple question, not to answer immediately, but to let it sit somewhere in you. If nothing changed from how it is right now, no improvement, no escalation, no sudden clarity from her side, would you still call this connection made for each other? Or would you start calling it what it actually feels like when you remove the future from it? Because sometimes the truth doesn't arrive as a shock. It arrives as a quiet recognition of what has already been consistent. There's a moment I've seen in men when everything becomes very quiet inside them. Not dramatic, not emotional, just quiet. It usually happens when they stop trying to predict what the other person is feeling, and they finally turn their attention back to what they are actually experiencing. Not the story, not the hope, the experience. And in that moment, something uncomfortable often becomes visible. Not that the connection was meaningless, not that the feelings were fake, but that they were carrying a level of emotional uncertainty that slowly started to feel normal. And that normalization is what keeps people in places they wouldn't choose if they were fully clear. Now listen carefully, because this is the part most people rush past. If someone truly feels made for you, it doesn't mean there is no complexity. It doesn't mean everything flows perfectly, but it does mean that over time, there is a sense of emotional settling, not emotional chasing. You don't feel like you're constantly trying to arrive somewhere in the connection. You're already there. Even in silence, even in distance, there is still a baseline of stability you can return to. And if that baseline is missing, your mind will try to replace it with meaning, with interpretation, with stories about timing, growth, potential, fate. But none of those things can substitute for emotional consistency. And I need to say this gently because it's important. Sometimes the deepest lesson in a connection like this is not how to make it work. It's learning how to see it clearly without inflating it beyond what it actually is right now. Because clarity is what breaks the loop. Not effort, not waiting, not proving yourself. Clarity. And clarity can feel unfamiliar at first because it removes the emotional noise you may have been used to living inside. But what it gives you in return is something much more stable. Your attention back, your energy back, your emotional center back in your own life instead of inside uncertainty. Now, I'm not telling you to decide anything in a rush. I'm not telling you to label her or erase what you felt. But I am asking you to notice something honestly. If this connection truly continues exactly as it is, no escalation, no sudden shift, no hidden meaning revealed later, does it still feel like alignment? Or does it feel like something you've been trying to emotionally complete on your own? Because at some point, love stops being about interpretation and starts being about what is actually happening between two people who are both present enough to meet each other where they are. And if that presence isn't mutual, then what you're feeling may not be a sign that you found the one. It may be a sign that you're ready for something that doesn't require so much emotional translation just to understand it. And that realization is where things finally begin to change.